Healthcare is changing, and Dr. Nancy RN is here for you. The topics are many, but each program stands on its own with 3 key action points for you to learn. Your guide to a healthier you in a changing world. Dr. Nancy RN.
Welcome to Dr. Nancy RN. Healthy world, healthy nation, healthy you. I'm Nancy Valentine, Ph.D. and registered nurse. And this show is dedicated to you, the healthcare consumer. And today we have a program that is the next installment in a series on autism, autism spectrum disorder. And today we're going to be talking about genetics. And our show title is Genetic Testing for Autism, Hot or Not. Now this is really a very important topic because genetics does play a role in many of the autism cases. And that's what we're trying to sort through and sift through. When does it work and when is it really relevant and when may it not be quite so, the situation. And because we don't know the real cause of genetics, it's really important that we filter through what is out there so that we come away with a better understanding of how this could be very informative for many people as individual autism spectrum disorder sufferers as well as their families. So we're going to be talking about a disorder that really affects 1 in 68 children, which is a really enormous number. Mainly male children versus female children, much more prevalent with the male children. But today we have 2 wonderful guests who are coming back to spend time with us and to really take us to that next step. Our first guest I'd like to introduce is Dr. Marian Reiff. Marian is at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and she's in a very interesting division of translational medicine and human genetics. And Marian is partnered with her colleague, Surabhi Mulchandani, who is a genetic counselor in the Division of Genetic Diagnostics at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So I want to welcome you back. It's just delightful to have both of you again.
Thank you.
We're happy to be here.
Right. They had so much fun in the first show, they wanted to come back. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. What will genetic testing tell me about my child's autism? The role of genetic testing and implications of these test results, which they will talk about how they're interpreted, for families and children with this disorder. So we're going to go through the role, the process, really how does it work? And then how does it really work to inform us? So we're going to get started with, I think, Surabhi or Marian. Who would like to start tackling this question?
I think Surabhi is going to talk first about the actual genetics of autism, and then I'll talk a little bit about how families understand those results.
Right. And I just want to point out why this is such a powerful partnership, because it's not just about having the test and the test results. All this translational part is what do you do with it, and that's where Marian's expertise comes in. So they really do a lot of this work together, and I think it's really important for you as consumers to know how these partnerships really work. So thanks, Surabhi. It's all yours.
Sure. So you know, Nancy, we always hear the question: is autism really genetic? And my answer is, in short, everything is genetic. But in autism in particular, we have realized that autism has a genetic component. Even before we knew much about genes, you know, what genes could do or what genes are or where they are, we knew that autism is heritable. And that was known by the experiments, the natural experiments, when you have twins. So you can have identical twins and non-identical twins. So the identical twins share all of their DNA in common. They start out as one cell that divides in 2 and that makes 2 babies. And the non-identical twins or the fraternal twins, they start out with 2 babies as any other siblings.
Right.
And it is a really good controlled experiment because the twins in general share the same environment. So to answer whether it's environment or genetic, that is really a good system. So what people have noticed from many years ago, that when one identical twin has autism, the other identical twin almost always has autism. But when non-identical twin, one of them has autism, it's not necessarily that the other one would have it too.
Right.
So in general, it is the same rate as siblings, and so if one sibling has autism, the rate for other sibling to have autism is about 10% to 20%. And so that's really what was seen. So they realized if you share more of your genes, the chances for having autism is more.
Right.
So they realized that autism has some genetic component, but it is slightly different from how we think about other genetic disorder. A lot of genetic disorder have one gene and many alterations in those genes. So there are faulty genes and they would give a particular kind of condition. Autism really is a mixed bag of condition. You know, we should be calling it autisms, right? Instead of calling one particular condition. So
well, that's very interesting. I like what you said in your opening sentence, and that is everything's genetic, because we are who we are because of our genetics. So the pool of genetics can be, you know, very interesting, like immediately from your mother, father, but it could be from many, many generations back. I mean, we're just a mixed bag of genes. And those genes come from all over the place in terms of how we are related as a species to one another in our family line. So I think that it's not like we're picking out genetics and autism as if it's some kind of like special thing, like an island unto itself. It's really part of teasing out the fact that we are all genetic products of our heritage. But are there things that are in these genes that are very specific to this disorder?
So they started looking at it, and you know, a few years ago people thought maybe there are 5 to 15 genes. If there are changes in those genes, they are going to cause autism. At this point we really think that you know, we were wrong, at least at the order of magnitude, and if there are thousands, there are at least hundreds of genes that changes in those could result in autism spectrum disorder. And just to give some perspective, we have about 20,000 or so genes in every single one of our cells. And these genes make us how we are and how we function. And genes don't work alone, they work in concert. So, and they work in different places in our body. So it is obvious, you know, if you start thinking about what is autism, autism could be pervasive developmental disorder, it could be communication disorder. So all those things that fall under this umbrella, they are all autism. So they're going to be caused by all these different conditions.
That is fascinating. Genes. I mean, first of all, the fact that we have 20,000 genes gives us 20,000 opportunities for all kinds of different combinations of anything.
Right.
And the fact that we're talking about this very wide spectrum of behaviors. It could be a gene in one person is affected is very different than a gene in someone else, and that's why you're getting very different behavioral manifestations, meaning demonstration of this disorder. Some people are completely nonverbal. Some people have very good verbal skills because it didn't hit that particular gene. Would that be a good translation?
Yeah, absolutely. And then genes don't work alone, so it is the environment with genes that work with it. So even in one family, when you have multiple people affected with autism or autism spectrum disorder, all those people are present differently.
Right.
So it's genes plus environment, but multiple genes and the environment.
Very good. So where do you start? I mean, it's such a big universe of possibilities.
Such a good question, and I'm so happy to answer it because you know, so these questions should really be answered by a clinical genetics evaluation. And the reason for that is that a team of geneticists and genetic counselors, so we have been trained to look for clues from even before the child is born to right up till now, and to go back into families. As you were saying, you know, our genes are coming from all over our family, so we have shared genes from our parents and grandparents. So we go back and look into all those things. And so in a clinical genetics evaluation, generally how an individual goes to clinical genetics evaluation is that the pediatrician notices that they could be concerned for developmental delay or for any kind of autism spectrum disorder, and then they are referred to clinical genetics to see if we can find an explanation. When such individuals and family come to see us, we go back into a full family history. So we go back 3 generations. We make you, we ask you all these questions and make you remember things from, you know, maybe you might not know want to, but how when you were pregnant, how was the pregnancy? Was there anything else that happened? How big was the child? What was the length? What was the weight? And what we are really trying to do is trying to find clues to see if it fits a specific picture of a condition, and if we have seen a child similar like the one that's in front of us, and if we know what that could be, and then we can do confirmatory testing. So there is this whole algorithm that we go through. So really orderly thing. So we would do a history and a physical exam. Then we would see if it is autism alone or if there's something else going on, and that's where we really make the distinction to start to do testing. And when there's something else going on, maybe there is a heart condition, maybe there is a skeletal condition like scoliosis when the spine is curved, that puts us into, okay, this is the ballpark we are thinking about for this particular person.
Now this is really interesting, because from what I'm understanding from what you're telling us, Surabhi, is that you're really sort of mapping this case by case. There isn't like a book you can open and it just says, you know, try this for this. I mean, you're trying to build that book. You're trying to write that book based on one genetic test at a time and all these observations. So it is a very involved process, but you can hear from Surabhi's explanation, it's involved for a reason, because these clues are part of the dynamic discussion that you are having with your treatment team and with the testers. So the more that you can remember those details, family histories are very important. In fact, we really should all be keeping very solid track of our family histories. We don't know when we're going to need them. So really finding out, having those conversations with relatives long before they're no longer around to have those conversations can be very instrumental in gathering that information that you may need someday. So I think that's a really great tip. So as you start looking at these observations and mapping the tests, what kinds of things are starting to come to light?
So some of the things that we see with autism spectrum disorder is that a lot of individuals have slightly larger head circumference, and so we would match it with their parents. And you know, these things run into families, and people have all sort of head sizes, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if a child has a larger head circumference than their parents on average, then we would think about a specific condition. But you know, all these things really are new. The genetic testing and the genetics, as we understand, is really new, and it's just becoming, it's expanding every day, and all the different testing that we can do. So as I was saying, if it is autism plus something, we would do very specific testing if we can identify a particular pattern, and if we do not, then we do testing for what is called the chromosome microarray testing, and that's really becoming a standard of testing these days.
Is that a test that sort of gives you the full picture before you start trying to slice through like which particular gene? It just sort of gives you that big overview.
Right.
Is that how it works?
It is like a fish net. It catches a lot of things, but it is like a fish net. It only catches things that are of that size. So it wouldn't, if you have a normal result, doesn't rule out everything, but it does catch a lot of things. So and so we would look at a visual in a second that describes this test a little more, and why it is such a great test to be looking at, especially for children with autism spectrum disorder.
Oh, good. Well, let's walk through that. Tell us what we're looking at.
So we are looking at this picture, and so we are go through all those different magnifying glasses. So the first picture is of a child, of an individual, and we are made up of all the different cells, which is the first magnifying glass. The second magnifying glass shows within the cell exists our genetic information, and the genetic information is packaged in chromosomes. And we went through this a little bit in our last show. So genetic information, so all these 20,000 genes are housed in chromosomes. And so for this chromosome microarray testing, we're really looking at the chromosome at a very high resolution. What we could do in past is look at the chromosomes and under microscope, now we look at it under at least 1,000 times higher resolution to see if there are pieces of chromosome they are missing or extra. So the last one really is showing a really tiny part of the chromosome that is magnified now multiple times, and we can see, well, maybe this looks different from the reference chromosome.
So you're really looking at shapes. It's really the shape of this chromosome.
We used to look at the shape of the chromosomes. Now we are chopping it up in DNA level, and we are looking at how many copies exist. And normal copy is 2, but you could have a part that is 1 or 3, and too much or too little or something is not good, and that's what we are trying to do here.
So it's both the shape from your visual. It was both the shape and the amount of.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
But we're not getting down, again, I'm very fascinated by what your knowledge is amazing. We're not getting down to the chemistry of it necessarily, like what is it made of?
Right, and it's made up of DNA, and that's what we are looking.
Okay.
So to go back again, so when you are seeing a geneticist and a genetic counselor and a genetic test is ordered, it really is a blood test. It sounds really fancy, but it is a blood test. And we take a spoonful of blood sample, and then we extract DNA from it, and we do the testing from this DNA.
Right.
And we are looking if it has as much DNA as we expect, or if it has parts that are extra or missing.
Right.
There have been multiple such missing or extra pieces that have been associated with autism spectrum disorder. But what's really interesting and a very important thing for all of us to understand is that not every missing or extra piece causes autism or some other condition. Some of this is just part of normal human diversity.
Right.
And so at this point, we're pretty good at seeing what causes it and versus what is just normal variation. But there still exists the gray zone when we don't necessarily know what that means.
But I think it's very reassuring that Surabhi told us that really, even though there's a lot going on behind the scenes, this is a very simple test to administer. So it's a blood sample. How simple is that in the whole scheme of things in terms of other kinds of tests that you might have for other conditions that are much more invasive and much more complicated and perhaps even more painful? So I think that this is really basically almost a painless test for which you can get an enormous amount of information, maybe.
Right, right. You do get a lot of information, and some people think that information is power, versus some other people information might be too much. Marian really has been looking at how families make meaning out of this information and how they deal with it. Academically, this information is fascinating. We want to find as much as we can find. We want to be able to do so much with it, and you can do a lot of different things with genetic information. Just medically, once you have explanation for a child's condition like autism spectrum disorder, it's empowering to families to understand what caused it. There wasn't anything that you could have done or not done that would have avoided it. So having that reassurance is huge. But even apart from that, once we have an explanation, we can tell you what are the chances of it occurring again in families. So for family planning reasons, once we have this information, we can compare this child to other children who have had similar genetic condition to tell you what to expect in future. So prognostic information, it also helps if we know that this particular change is seen with autism, but it may also have maybe a heart involvement at some point. We can, before even it starts to present with a heart condition, we can start monitoring it. So doing all those screening.
So you see a lot of other things. There are a lot of different fish in that net.
Exactly.
Really good.
Exactly.
Well, let's turn our attention from science, which is fascinating, and an amazing amount of work is being done in this field, and it's really changing very rapidly. As we heard, every day new information is coming along. But this is where there's the cross-section between science and real people. And that's where your expertise comes in, Marian.
Well, that's why we thought it was so important to do the study looking at how families understand this information, what they do with it, what's the experience like for them going through this testing and having this genetic information that's so new and that many doctors don't even completely understand.
Right.
So we thought it was very important, not just in the autism community, but to look at genetic testing that's done, especially pediatric testing, because this is our children that are going through this for the first time. These are the first families who are getting this new information. And it's important as a society to put in place some regulations about keeping this information private, making sure that people are not discriminated against because of genetic information that might come to light. And there is the funding for our study comes from the National Institutes of Health, where they do have a program that looks at the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic testing.
Tell us about, what is the name of the study? What's the title of it?
Well, the title is The Impact of Uncertainty in Genetic Testing for Autism Spectrum Disorders. And the reason we were focusing on uncertainty is Surabhi mentioned that in some situations the test result is not that clear. It's an ambiguous result. It's partly because it's so new, that it's still evolving, and scientists might come up with some result that we can't say it's completely normal, and we can't say this causes a particular disorder, so it's in this gray zone.
Right.
And we were very interested, what do people do with this information? How do they understand it? And how does it affect their family life?
Right. I think that's a very fair set of questions, because I'm envisioning this, and I'm sure our viewers are having the same response, and that is, since it isn't definitive, it's evolving. It's almost like I picture the scientists and the treatment team and the patients sort of all holding hands together, trying to sort of figure out together, how is this really going to work? And is that what you're finding in your study?
Well, I think that's a great way to look at it, and that's an ideal situation where everybody understands that it is evolving. I think, and many parents do, and they're really on board with whatever information we can find out. That's great. But many parents are also confused by the information. Like they say, well, they gave us this test and now I don't know what it means. And no matter what question they ask, they're still confused, because what they don't realize is that even the geneticist is not so sure about what it means. So I think once you clarify that, just that one fact, that really the geneticist doesn't know the answer yet, I think a lot of families will then accept and move on and really come to understand it in a new way.
Well, that's very good and very, very positive. But can you just explore a little bit further? What are the points of not understanding? When people keep asking over and over, I don't get it. I mean, I see this information and we've been trying to understand it. What do you think are the reasons underneath of that people don't understand?
Yeah, we've looked at that, and many parents have said that in the first place, they weren't that well prepared for the test. So when Surabhi was saying you have a genetics evaluation, you talk with your genetics team and that they prepare you for this test. And that's, again, an ideal situation. In many situations now, because it's a first-tier test, this kind of genomic test is actually provided now by pediatricians even. Developmental pediatricians, neurologists, pediatricians, all kinds of specialists who don't have really the genetics training to be able to interpret the results very well.
So this is like good news and bad news.
Yes.
It's more accessible to get this so-called simple blood test.
Yes.
But if it's being done by people who themselves are not very knowledgeable, then it's almost like you have the blood test and that's almost where it stops.
Right, and that's in a way then obviously that pediatrician or neurologist would say, well, I can't interpret this, so you need to see a geneticist. But then it's going to take them several months sometimes to get an appointment with the geneticist. And during that time, they're racking their brains, they're going on the internet saying, you know, what does this mean? They might be finding some quite misleading and quite worrying information on the internet that's not appropriate for this child, because you have to be very specific about exactly what that test result says. It can be a very small deletion on a chromosome.
So let me just stop you there. So in the world of helping everyone become a savvy consumer, if someone offers you this test, you really have to have the second step already organized so that you're not waiting this very long period of time to really understand what the test means. I mean, the analogy is if you're getting tested for breast cancer, you don't want to wait 6 months to find out. What does this really mean? You want to know like immediately.
Yeah.
So how would you instruct our listeners to have that really savvy conversation with, say, their pediatrician or whoever else is really offering them with all the best intentions to have this test? What would you say?
I would say that the more informed the family is, the better. And there are places where, we'll give you some resources on our tip sheet where there are some parent organizations even. But I think that asking whatever the provider is, how you can contact a genetic counselor is really key when you go into this test. And many families we spoke with, even though they had been in the team, there was a genetic counselor involved, they didn't know that.
They didn't know it.
They didn't know it was a genetic counselor.
Nobody identified themselves as, here I am, the genetic counselor, and my role is.
Yeah. So when we said, have you had any genetic counseling? Have you spoken with a genetic counselor? They said no. And I knew for a fact that they had. I said, well, who gave you the result? Oh, the doctor's assistant called me and just told me the result. They didn't know that was a genetic counselor. So they really don't know then that they can direct those questions to that person.
Right. So I think this is a heads up for anyone that's in the field, is that, again, it's evolving. You have to be so specific about who's doing what does it mean, how does it work, because if you can fill in the gaps as the provider or anyone in this chain of treatment team members or diagnosticians, it's really critical. Otherwise, why would people have any understanding of what this team is doing? So really, not only does the consumer have to ask those questions, but so do the treatment team and others have to be more forthcoming, is what I'm hearing. You really have to spell it out for people.
Yeah. And I think because it's so new and evolving, we're learning as we go. But the information we're getting from the parents is helping us to improve the process for the next people.
Right.
So it's
well,
important.
I think part of what we're trying to say in our show, our title, Hot or Not, I mean, you're in the field. And people are listening to this, and many of us really are hearing it for the first time. We are not living this day to day like you are. Would you guide people to get these tests done?
Well, I think it's important to discuss it with your provider, and it's important to inform yourself. We have some parents who did discuss it with their providers, and they were told, oh, don't worry about it. They were told by their pediatrician or their developmental pediatrician. And the reason for that is that in about 80% of children tested, the result comes back normal, negative. So that's what they're used to seeing.
So they don't think it's worth it.
So they don't think it's worth it, yeah. And so they might say, well, it's not really going to change anything. And that's also something to really understand as a parent, that even if you find a positive result, which is a cause, so you found a cause for your child's autism, it doesn't necessarily lead to any different treatments yet. It's part of the process.
But I can feel Surabhi sitting right next to me, and she is salivating with the idea that everyone would have it, if nothing else, to really enlighten this fund of knowledge, because it may not necessarily change what you would do with your child. It could. It may not, if 80% are coming back so-called normal. But we don't really know what normal is yet. So the more that we can participate and get that information, I think the better off we will be. That's what I'm hearing from our guests. Now, this is a very deep topic, and one where we could really explore many other aspects, and hopefully we will. But this show was really to just sort of give you a heads up on some of the trends from people that are really on the cutting edge of this work, both at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. As one of our guests said, Philadelphia is one of the hotbeds of autism research and treatment. And so for those of you who are in this area, you can really take advantage of that. Now, I think that this whole series on autism is really serving to inform us about what are our options, because you as a consumer want to take advantage of everything you possibly can. So I hope that you've enjoyed our program today and that you have learned something that you can take away either for yourself or other people that you know. Thank you for being with us, and remember, With health, all things are possible. Have a wonderful day. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today and that the information will help you in meeting your health goals. Catch this program and other conversations on the website, drnancyrn.com. Or you can write to me as well. I welcome your comments and feedback. Thank you for listening and join us again. And remember, with health, all things are possible.